You've probably heard cruise ships carry way more fuel than a voyage needs, and you likely assume it's a safety cushion, extra fuel in case of a storm, a rerouted itinerary, or some emergency at sea. That explanation sounds reasonable. It's also almost completely wrong. The real reason a cruise ship holds close to double what the trip requires has almost nothing to do with running out of fuel. It has everything to do with what happens to the ship as that fuel disappears. Let's start with the numbers, because they're bigger than most people expect. A large modern cruise ship can carry anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 metric tons of fuel at once, spread across dozens of separate tanks low in the hull. Some ships hold well over 1 million gallons combined, distributed across 15 or 20 individual compartments rather than one giant reservoir. On a typical week-long voyage, a mid-sized ship can burn through well over 100 metric tons a day just to keep the lights on, the engines turning, the pools heated, and thousands of people fed. That's an enormous amount of weight sitting deep in the belly of the ship, and every single ton of it is doing 2 jobs at once. One job is obvious, it's energy. The other job is one almost nobody talks about, and it's the one that actually explains why there's so much fuel in the first place. Ask any passenger why the ship carries a fuel buffer, and you'll get some version of the same answer. What if the weather turns bad and the captain has to take a longer route around a storm? What if a port closes and the ship has to divert somewhere unplanned? What if the ship needs to run at full power for hours in an emergency? All of that is genuinely true. Contingency fuel for weather and rerouting is a real line item in every voyage plan, calculated by the ship's routing office before it ever leaves the dock. But on its own, that contingency is a relatively small slice of the total reserve. It doesn't come close to explaining why the tanks on a ship this size are built as large as they are, or why naval architects treat that fuel load as something far more complicated than a simple range calculation. Here's what almost nobody outside naval architecture actually knows. A cruise ship does not necessarily get more stable as it gets lighter. In a lot of cases, over the course of a voyage, it gets less stable. And the reason for that lies inside every one of those fuel tanks. This matters more for a cruise ship than it does for almost any other kind of vessel at sea. A container ship or a bulk carrier is built low and wide, with most of its weight stacked close to the waterline. A cruise ship is the opposite. It's 14 or 18 decks of cabins, restaurants, glass elevators, and open pool areas stacked high above the hull, which already pushes its center of gravity uncomfortably close to the danger zone before a single ton of fuel is even considered. Naval architects design that top-heavy shape around a stability margin that assumes the fuel sitting low in the hull is doing its part to counterbalance everything stacked above it. Anything that quietly chips away at that counterbalance, tank by tank, matters far more on a ship shaped like this than it would on a ship that was already low and heavy to begin with. Picture a fuel tank completely full, packed edge to edge with no room for the liquid inside to move. From a stability standpoint, that tank is basically solid. The fuel can't shift, so its weight behaves exactly like a fixed block bolted to the hull. Now picture that same tank sitting half empty. Every time the ship rolls even slightly, the fuel sloshes toward the low side. That moving weight doesn't just sit there, it actively pushes the ship further into the roll it's already making, like a passenger who leans the wrong way at exactly the wrong moment on a small boat. Naval architects call this the free surface effect, and it's one of the most dangerous, least talked about forces on any vessel that carries liquid in bulk, whether that's fuel, fresh water, or ballast. A full tank has almost zero free surface effect. A genuinely empty tank has almost none either. It's the tank sitting right around the halfway mark that creates the maximum problem, and that's true regardless of how big or small the tank actually is. Counterintuitively, it's the emptying tank that becomes dangerous, not the full one. The ship is often at its structurally heaviest and its most forgiving on day 1, and at its most delicate to manage on day 5 or 6, once a dozen different tanks have all drained down toward that dangerous middle range at slightly different rates. If that sounds backwards, you're not alone. It takes most people a second to process that a lighter ship can be a less stable one. That's exactly the kind of, wait, seriously? Moment this channel is built around. So if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time, because this is really just the beginning of how strange this gets. To understand why this actually matters in practice, you need one more concept, metacentric height, or GM for short. Every ship has this number, and it's essentially the vessel's built-in tendency to roll and then return to upright on its own, the way a weighted toy rights itself, no matter how hard you push it over. A healthy GM means the ship leans into a wave and comes right back. A GM that drops too low means the ship starts to hang at an angle instead of righting itself properly, a condition naval architects call an angle of lull. The vessel settles into a tilt and stays there instead of standing back up straight, even in calm water. International maritime regulations set a minimum GM that every passenger ship has to maintain at all times over the course of a voyage, and the margin is stricter for a ship carrying several thousand passengers and crew than it is for an ordinary cargo vessel carrying nobody but its crew. Free surface effect in a slack tank doesn't sink a ship on its own, but it directly eats into that GM number, tank by tank, and on a voyage running a week or two, with dozens of tanks slowly draining at different rates depending on which generators and engines happen to be pulling from which supply that day, that erosion compounds day after day. A ship that felt rock solid leaving port can behave noticeably differently a week later if nobody on board is actively managing what's happening inside those tanks. So naval architects and marine engineers solve this problem two separate ways, and both of them show up directly in why the ship left port carrying so much fuel to begin with. First, the tanks themselves are engineered around the problem before the ship is even built. Instead of one wide fuel tank running the full width of the hull, the tank is split into narrow port, center, and starboard sections, separated by longitudinal bulkheads, because a narrower tank produces a dramatically smaller free surface effect for the exact same volume of liquid. It's the same reason a shallow tray of water is far harder to spill than a deep bowl holding the same amount. The shape and width of the container changes how violently the liquid inside it can move, independent of how much liquid is actually in there. Some ships take this further and subdivide a single large tank into 3 or 4 separate cells instead of just 3, specifically to shrink that free surface moment down as far as possible on paper before construction even starts. Second, and this is the part that connects everything back to the fuel gauge, is what happens while the ship is actually at sea. As fuel burns down inside a given tank over the course of the voyage, the crew doesn't just let it drain and sit there slack. On many vessels, engineers deliberately keep a tank topped up by transferring fuel between compartments as needed, or compensate the lost weight by pumping in seawater ballast to replace it, specifically so a large tank never sits in that dangerous half-empty middle zone for very long. This is an active, ongoing process, not a one-time calculation done in port. It's tracked on a stability computer on the bridge, with an officer regularly entering tank soundings from every compartment and watching the ship's calculated GM shift in something close to real time as fuel is consumed hour by hour, day after day, for the length of the entire crossing. That's the actual answer to the question this video opened with. Carrying close to double the fuel, a straight line range calculation would require gives the crew room to manage that burn down properly across the entire voyage, keeping tanks pressed full or genuinely empty rather than slack, keeping the ship's trim level from bow to stern instead of tipping forward or aft as weight shifts unevenly, and keeping that GM number safely inside regulatory limits the whole time on a vessel that might not touch a fuel dock again for a week or more. It isn't a cushion against running dry in the middle of the ocean. It's raw material for a stability calculation that runs continuously for the entire length of the cruise, adjusted constantly rather than set once and forgotten. Trim is worth pausing on because it's a slightly different problem than roll, even though the two get managed together. Roll is the ship tipping side to side, which is what free surface effect inside a single tank makes worse. Trim is the ship tipping forward or backward, bow to stern, and it happens when the fuel being burned off isn't distributed evenly along the length of the hull. A ship that's engineered to run its forward fuel tanks down faster than its aft tanks, without a plan to correct it, will gradually start sitting lower at the stern than the bow, which changes how the hull moves through water and how efficiently the propellers actually bite. So the same tank management system doing all that work against free surface effect is simultaneously being used to keep the ship level end to end, transferring fuel fore and aft as needed, not just port to starboard. And once you know to look for it, you start noticing this kind of hidden engineering everywhere on a ship this size, which is honestly the whole reason this channel exists. If you want more of exactly this, hit subscribe now, because we're only getting started. This is also why fuel is treated as one of the most tightly tracked numbers on the entire ship, and not just as an operating cost. A large cruise ship can spend well over $15,000 a day on fuel, and a single week-long voyage can rack up more than $100,000 in fuel alone before the ship ever reaches its home port again. Every one of those tons is priced, tracked, and mapped to a specific tank, because the fuel department and the stability department are, in practice, working off the exact same set of numbers instead of two separate ones. Burn the wrong tank down too far without compensating for it, and you haven't just spent money on fuel you didn't need to use yet. You've quietly changed how the entire ship handles in a swell without a single alarm going off to tell anyone walking the decks that anything has shifted at all. It's also why the newest generation of cruise ships, the ones running on liquefied natural gas instead of traditional heavy fuel oil, had to solve this exact same problem all over again from scratch. LNG is stored as a cryogenic liquid, kept at roughly minus 160 degrees Celsius, inside completely different tank shapes than conventional fuel oil tanks, with its own free surface behavior and its own weight distribution as it's consumed over a voyage. Naval architects couldn't just copy the old compensating tank playbook line for line. They had to build entirely new stability models for a fuel type that essentially didn't exist on cruise ships a generation ago, which tells you how seriously this specific problem is taken industry-wide, on decades-old ships and brand new ones alike. There's a smaller detail hiding in this same system that most people would never think to ask about. When seawater is pumped in to compensate for burned fuel, it obviously can't be allowed to mix with the fuel that's still left in that same tank. So compensating tanks are built with the seawater and the fuel kept as separate layers, with the fuel floating on top, and the system is designed so the water can be pumped back out again before the tank is ever refilled with new fuel at the next port. It's a small piece of plumbing most passengers will never see or hear about, but it exists purely to keep a stability trick invisible to everyone standing on the pool deck 14 stories above it. None of this is theoretical caution left over from an era of worse engineering. Free surface effect is still one of the leading causes cited whenever investigators look into a vessel that develops a dangerous, unexplained list at sea with no obvious external cause, no storm, no collision, nothing visibly wrong from the outside. A tank that was allowed to sit slack for too long on any class of ship is one of the first things a stability investigation checks, precisely because the effect leaves no dramatic warning sign until the GM has already dropped further than anyone on board realized. That's exactly why cruise lines don't treat this as a background detail left to chance. It's monitored deliberately, continuously, and with enough spare fuel on board that the crew is never forced to run a tank down into that danger zone just to make it to the next port on schedule. Now here's the part that ties every piece of this together, because it's easy to lose track of just how constant this monitoring actually is. This isn't a calculation the ship's officers run once a day and then set aside. On a modern cruise ship, the loading and stability computer is effectively running in the background for the entire voyage, the same way a car's engine computer is constantly adjusting fuel and timing without the driver ever noticing. Every tank on board has its own sounding sensor. Every one of those readings feeds into a single live model of the ship's current GM, its current trim, and its current list, updated continuously as fuel is consumed and ballast is shifted to compensate. The officer running that model isn't just watching numbers scroll past for the sake of it, because every transfer between tanks has to be logged and cross-checked, and moving fuel or ballast in the wrong sequence can create exactly the kind of temporary slack condition the whole system is designed to avoid. It's a live, ongoing balancing act for the entire duration of the voyage, not a box that gets checked once before departure. The fuel reserve sitting in the tanks on day one isn't just potential energy for the engines. It's the raw material that model runs on for the length of the entire crossing, and the ship is quietly rebalancing itself against that model the whole time, whether anyone on the pool deck ever notices or not. And once you start looking at a cruise ship this way, you realize that reserve isn't really excess fuel at all. It's a working part of the ship's stability system, not separate from it, running for as long as the tanks still have fuel left to compensate with. That's also part of why you'll never see a cruise ship allowed to limp into port running close to empty, even on a route where it easily has the range to do it safely. Ending a voyage with tanks that are still mostly full and easy to keep pressed is a deliberate operating choice, built into how the voyage was planned from the very first day, not leftover caution from a more conservative era of shipbuilding. The fuel still sitting in the tank when the ship finally docks was never just sitting there as a spare. It was doing its job for the entire crossing, quietly keeping several $100 million of steel standing upright in open water, one carefully monitored tank at a time. So the next time someone tells you a cruise ship carries backup fuel in case it runs out, you'll know the real story is almost the opposite of that. That fuel was never really about finishing the trip. It was about making sure the ship was still standing up straight when it got there. If you've ever been on a cruise and felt the ship handle just slightly differently on the last night compared to the first, a little more roll, a little less of that solid, planted feeling, drop it in the comments. You weren't imagining it. You were feeling this exact system working underneath you the entire time, tank by tank, whether anyone on board ever explained why. That's really the whole idea behind this channel. The ship you're standing on is quietly solving problems like this every single hour of every voyage, and almost none of it ever makes it into the brochure or the muster drill. If you want more of the engineering hiding under the deck beneath your feet, subscribe. There's a lot more of